everybody, and welcome to the Dissecting Fiction podcast. I'm Vinny Murphy.
And I'm Christian Kutlick.
And today on the show, we're going to dive a little bit into the character known as Venom. That was a little pretentious, but that's mostly because of King in Black is in stores now.
King in Black, we're getting all the nullified variants, and which is just Venom, but with more red on him, really. We figured it'd be a good time to talk about Venom and his many, many different incarnations, especially since he's been pretty hot recently, just outside of King in Black. There's just been a lot of hype around the character, especially with all the different versions and the directions they've taken with him recently.
Yeah, and I think it's important to clarify, we're not going to talk about every Venom story and every time there was a symbiote on someone. That would, first of all, be incredibly boring, I think, after a while. Second of all, would probably be a 6-7 hour podcast, and we don't want to do that, and we don't think you want to listen to that. So we're largely going to follow the main narrative for Venom. I'm sure we're going to miss a few things here and there, but this is really more about the, I guess, direction the character has taken since arguably the character is first appearing in the mid-'80s. We'll get into that a little bit too. And how that's changed over the years. And, especially where we are now, where Venom in 2020 is once again one of Marvel's hottest characters.
Yeah, I mean, he started off as a costume, and now he's become his own, legacy hero at this point.
Yeah, and we can hit the ground running with that too. It's interesting you mentioned starting as a costume. The first origins of Venom, or the symbiote black suit at this point, come from a young man at the time named Randy Schueller, who had submitted a story through a Marvel Creator contest to put Spider-Man into a black costume. It's actually a pretty cool costume. If you're listening to this on YouTube, you're going to see it. So if anyone is listening to this and they want to kind of scroll back, you can always catch us on Dissecting Fiction on YouTube. And we're going to have a lot of pictures of the different costumes over this episode. You'll notice if you look at that costume that the spider is red. It does have the distinctive hand patches, which I think are, for whatever reason, one of the coolest additions to the design. I just don't understand why it's cool. The thing about this is, the young Mr. Schueller won this contest, clearly. He was paid $220 for his basic story and the design. It seemed that there was some sort of expectation that he was going to do more. That never came to fruition. And his story was very different. They did eventually publish it last year in a one-shot with a bunch of other black costume stories. The interesting thing about Randy Schueller's story is it's not really about an alien symbiote. It's about a unstable molecule costume that Reed Richards makes for Spider-Man so he can do stealth missions. The Wasp is also involved because, especially at that time, one of the big aspects of her character was that she was wearing a different costume every appearance, and she was supposed to be the sort of fashion plate. Very simple story. Nothing too over the top, probably why it wasn't used, but I 100% understand Jim Shooter looking at that design and going, okay, yeah, I do want that, which is a good place to start in general with this, that we've mentioned this on a few different podcasts. Spider-Man might be the only character to have two absolutely classic costumes.
I mean, you look at that original cover appearance, and it's just such a standout. That all black, it looks really sleek on him compared to that kind of complex design on Spider-Man beforehand. Is such a contrast.
Yeah, it's interesting too because it is almost the opposite logic to why the original costume is cool. It's this really complex, unique costume against this very simple but still unique costume. Your main element that remain are the eyes. The spider's totally different. There's no webbing. It's very different in general. That suit would take 2 years to get to the page from 1982. 1984, first appearance of the suit is in Amazing Spider-Man 252, written by Tom DeFalco and Roger Stern with pencils by Ron Frenz. There is a little debate. Some people say it's also Marvel Team Up 140, which was also DeFalco and Owsley, who would better be known as Christopher Priest in the 90s. 252 is the cover. It's the tribute to the Amazing Fantasy cover with the new black costume Spider-Man swinging. The origin of this costume would not be revealed until about 7 months later in December in Secret Wars 8. Script by Jim Shooter, pencils by Mike Zeck. Zeck, also a pretty seminal Spider-Man artist going forward. I tried to do research on this to figure out where the idea for the symbiote suit came from. I couldn't find any good interviews online. I'm sure somewhere in an old issue, a back issue, or a comics journal, there is one. Looking at the way it's set up, I think it was Jim Shooter who probably came up with that story. I've read a couple interviews with DeFalco where it seemed like he was sort of along for the ride. But what we can talk about is whomever had conceived this didn't necessarily think that this costume was going to last very long. It seemed like it was one storyline, and it really was about Spider-Man discovering that this costume was evil in a sense.
It's weird to hear that like people didn't really think this costume was going to stick around for a while, because it is like that. Like, it just kind of shows up with it for a bit, and it's just kind of a cool new thing. But like them, I guess later finding out a story behind that is the interesting part to me, because it's like you're coming up with the design first and then the character later, like pretty literally here.
That's another thing that when I was reading, I got this implication that maybe the timing had gotten messed up for some reason, that, Secret Wars probably should have come out first. It's hard to say. Like I said, the problem is a lot of interviews these days are being done like through podcasts, and what is 8 hours of research in total can end up 16 hours of research really easily. So I will be the first to admit that I did not listen to everything I possibly could, but I did try to track down written or transcribed interviews, and I just was not seeing a lot on the specifics of that. Here's an interesting thing that doesn't come up and has kind of been lost to time. Spider-Man does not actually have the alien symbiote suit on for most of the run of the black costume. 1985, Web of Spider-Man 1 eliminates the symbiote version of the black costume, and Spider-Man starts to go back and forth between his classic costume and the black costume. Everything I read indicated that this decision to leave the black costume in place, they have Black Cat give him a cloth version of it, was because of the positive reaction to the design.
That doesn't surprise me at all. Marvel's good at one thing, is capitalizing on what's popular.
Here's one of the cooler things about this that a lot of people kind of blow by when they talk about the origins of the character. In 1986, Web of Spider-Man 18, Dave Michelini and Mark Silvestri with Kyle Baker, that's a pretty impressive team, do a story where they finally eliminate the red and blue costume for good. But that is part of that story, is that the costume is destroyed. Spider-Man will now permanently be in this black costume because it's the 80s, it's hip. At the end of that issue, a hand is seen shoving Peter Parker onto a train track. He's able to get off of the train track before getting hit, but someone pushed him who did not activate his spider sense. And this is actually the first appearance of Eddie Brock before Eddie Brock is ever named. Is kind of a cool little touch from a writer who had way more confidence that they were going to be on a book for a long time.
I think that's what they call a first cameo appearance.
Yeah, for a long time too. I don't even think people realized it was out there. That's one of the cool things about the internet with comic books, is so many things are popping up where someone will point out like, hey, they actually did this first, and then people will realize that things that they said were the first appearance for years actually weren't. It's an interesting situation. There's really not much in between there and 1988. March of 1988, we get Amazing Spider-Man 298 with Dave Michelini. Like I said, confident that he'd be around, is around. And, of course, Todd McFarlane. This begins the first real Venom arc Spider-Man's still in the black costume at the beginning of this story, but Todd McFarlane hated the black costume. So they literally, he came into the Spider-Man office. This is from an interview with him. He had done Hulk. They wanted him on Spider-Man. And basically he said, all right, I'll do Spider-Man, but you got to get rid of that costume. And it sounds like Dave Michelini basically turned around and said, okay, I know how to do that, but you got to give me 3 issues. So we have Amazing Spider-Man 298. Spider-Man still in the black costume fighting a character called Chance. Most of the issue is focused on that. Near the end, we get to see someone who is apparently stalking Spider-Man, a lot of newspaper clippings, nothing clear shown. 299, still fighting Chance, still in the black costume. But we do end with the first appearance of Venom, very brief cameo in Shadow, leading to Amazing Spider-Man 300, where we get the full story. We are filled in that Eddie Brock had been a columnist who had misidentified the Sin Eater. Peter Parker / Spider-Man had revealed the real identity of the Sin Eater, ruining Eddie Brock's career. And he eventually ends up in the church, wherein the symbiote was released. The symbiote bonds to him because of their mutual hatred of Spider-Man. And now he is back for revenge because he feels that he is wronged, which is something that is pretty important to the character, especially at this stage.
Yeah, early on is all about like that feeling of like he's kind of mostly just an anti-hero who uses violence in very extreme ways, and that sense of vengeance he has against Spider-Man. Now it's a lot different. Spider-Man's basically uninvolved with Venom at this point, beyond just the backstory.
Yeah, it's interesting, that tie between them. And I think the most important thing there, especially for how the character is written following that, and we'll continue to get into that, is Venom doesn't believe he's wrong, which is a big deal. And wherein he does threaten Mary Jane, he doesn't really outright attack her. This leads to Venom being captured. And it does so in something that I miss so much in comic books, where like that can happen in one issue. Eventually is sent to the vault. Mary Jane now hates the black costume, probably channeling McFarlane's feelings a little bit, and remakes Spider-Man's red and blue costume for him, which I think is actually kind of cool because of how differently McFarlane actually drew the costume. It almost implies that Mary Jane's version was the McFarlane costume.
Yeah, that is a cool detail. I do also think it's like Todd McFarlane has made probably one of the most iconic versions of Venom, and I just find it funny that it was out of his hate of the black suit.
Yeah. But what's funny too is David Michelini clearly had an idea of where Venom was going. David Michelini said in interviews that he finds the most interesting thing about Venom to be his ability to avoid spider sense. That was really the thing that was the hook for him, because Spider-Man had fought so many villains who, would overpower him, who would do any number of things, but Spider-Man always had that little advantage, and that was taken away with Venom. Which I think is interesting, because in a lot of the media, like the Spider-Man cartoons, that's always something that's played up. It is a good idea. It's something where if you're not familiar with the character of Venom and you need to introduce them, that's like a jarring way to do so.
Yeah, usually they introduce him as I think that has to do a lot with the Spider-Man 3 film, where he's kind of a representation of Peter Parker's frustration with his life going wrong. I know that's not exactly what happened in the comic, but I do think that is generally where Venom has grown out from. Even like, but you can see those roots here.
Yeah, and Venom becomes immediately popular. His next appearance is going to be in 1989, Amazing Spider-Man, still the Michelini McFarlane era, 315 through 317. This is essentially a story of Venom escaping the vault. It's really just another fight, a big fight between them. It's cool. An important aspect of that, though, is at the end of it, the symbiote briefly rebonds with Spider-Man. Venom, Spider-Man, and the symbiote all kind of commune and have a different understanding. And Spider-Man leaves Eddie Brock and the symbiote essentially knocked out on the beach and just like walks away.
It's not arcs, which is weird to see. There's a fight and the fight ends.
I mean, they're briefer arcs. I am of the school that believes that that's the direction we should be going back in. I think we've gotten a little too obsessed with everything being 6 to 12 issues. I think it also helps keeps the characters fresh if they don't have to be in the book forever. After showing up again in Spider-Man 315 through 317, we start to see Venom popping up a little more in other places. But I would still say that the next most important chapter would be under Michelini and Larson. Once again, Venom returns. Eric Larson adds something to the character that would become fairly iconic, and that is the swirling tongue.
The gross ass tongue.
The gross tongue popping up around issue 344 is where that little run starts. After that, Venom's really off to the races. Everyone's drawing him with the tongue, by the way.
Yeah, it's like I think even though we're showing images of this, I think it's good to point out that like Todd McFarlane kind of drew Venom differently than what he's currently shown as very often. Like Todd McFarlane kind of shown Venom just like a big beefy black suited Spider-Man.
Yeah, with like teeth, and there's definitely like I think there's a cool thing about that because it's the costume smiling at you.
Yeah, it's like there's a really like cool simplicity to it, and like over time they added more and more monstrous details.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to say it. By Amazing Spider-Man 362, which is the emergence of Carnage, he kind of has lips at that point when Mark Bagley is drawing him, which influences the animated version. And it's from that point on, it really is. He's just sort of all over the place. He's popping up in Spider-Man books. He's popping up in Ghost Rider and Blaze Spirits of Vengeance, teaming up, or I guess fighting Wolverine more in Marvel Comics Presents. He becomes even more established than he was. And this all leads to 1993's Venom Lethal Protector, where we finally get to play off of the fact that, Venom, as they say in Wreck-It Ralph, just because he's a bad guy doesn't mean he's a bad guy.
Yeah, they sort of add more pathos to him around here. Like here he's actually like I think Lethal Protector is a great title to like really exemplify how different he is from Spider-Man at this point. Because I think Venom here becomes a really unique villain for Spider-Man in that he's very similar to him. I mean, not design wise, but like power wise and things like that. But the big difference between him and Spider-Man is that he actually kills people and he doesn't really have the same optimism as Peter Parker has.
There's also a little bit of, especially in this era, it really starts with the McFarlane era, but it's all Michelini, so it's all the same writer. He's a little more crazy. Like
Yeah.
you almost feel bad for him because he's unhinged. And that's something that I think is maybe lost a little bit. We'll talk about that when we get to the Donny Cates run. Not 100% lost, but to an extent. Lethal Protector is also where they start really playing with the possibilities of all these other symbiotes being out there, which leads nearly directly into Maximum Carnage.
The other big symbiote, Carnage.
Yeah, if you have like any doubt of how hot this character got and how quickly this really all happened, I think 1993 is the year where Venom establishes himself. I mean, he's not establishing anything, he doesn't exist, but where the character is really established as this main cast, big Spider-Man character, if not just his own character. A Maximum Carnage also brings a lot of great art into the mix, a lot of art that survives to this day. You've got Sal Buscema working on those books. You got Tom Lyle, Alex Saviuk, probably the most underrated Spider-Man artist. He's so firmly established both narratively and visually at that point that it just becomes an undeniable character and goes on to another miniseries almost immediately after Maximum Carnage, which is Funeral Pyre.
Yeah, it's weird seeing the Carnage costume next to the Venom costume. That like the Carnage costume is like on principle just like really simple. It's like the Spider-Man costume without all the webbing detail, but like really, it's like just kind of like a fucked up Spider-Man look, and that like the lines are just all over the place on it. It looks really like veiny and everything, and I think it's also another contrast to like what the Venom costume was, which is just like a very clean black look.
Yeah, that's a cool thing that I've never really thought too hard about, but you're totally right. It's really them exploiting the two Spider-Man costumes and turning them into evil versions of them. That's yeah. I've not really thought about that hard, but you're totally right. Yeah, and at that point, it's not even really worth mentioning how many freaking times Eddie Brock shows up as Venom over 1993, 1994. Really, it seems almost like any time that they can justify him showing up, he does, whether it be his own miniseries or he's teaming up with a Night Watch there, which is cool. Remember when they said there was going to be a Night Watch movie? What happened with that? But yeah, he's just everywhere. 1993, 1994.
Well, I think it really like when you said he's like Wolverine at this point, he really is like. I think even with Wolverine, it's like that trend extended past the 80s, but like in the mid 90s, like it was really just like the age of Venom. Like everyone was fighting him.
Yeah, and you get separation anxiety 1995, 94 into 95. You really establish a lot of the other symbiotes. Also gets a Genesis and Super Nintendo game that's less popular than Maximum Carnage. But yeah, it is just like at this point the possibilities become somewhat endless for the character. And I think that era of Venom is what, even to this day, a lot of people picture.
Well, I think also his promise came about because Spider-Man, like the Spider-Man books, there were so fucking many of them at this point, and almost all of them are kind of bad. Like Spider-Man was stuck in the Clone Saga at this point, which
Yeah,
is
just coming off of a lot of that. Venom's height is really intertwined with like the Scarlet Spider Ben Reilly era, which of course Venom shows up in some of those books. But like I said, if we went over every time Venom showed up at this time, once again we'd have another 6-hour podcast. One of the miniseries that I think is pretty significant that does come around is in 1995, and that's Venom Sinner Takes All. I would say this one stands out because it does have the sequences with Anne Weying, Eddie Brock's ex-wife, who would become She-Venom. The cover image of her on issue 3 of Sinner Takes All is pretty much how people picture She-Venom. It is absolutely the basis for her appearance in the Venom film, which is another reason I think it's significant. And though this would be a retcon, they do explain Anne giving birth to Dylan Brock, who is Eddie's son and a much bigger part of the story after her suicide and in Donny Cates' Venom.
yeah, that's like not for like another 30 years at this point though. There's don't worry, audience. There's going to be like tons of retcons between here and now.
Yeah, we had a little discussion before we got into this podcast too of how to handle the fact that, quite frankly, there are so many retcons and so many little details that get dropped in over the 30-year history that we're just going to talk about them when we think they're relevant. We can't really come up with a real plan. There's another one coming, don't worry. So this continues really through the 90s. Spider-Man and Venom tangle quite a bit. Venom often gets his own miniseries, which I think is kind of interesting that throughout the 90s they're not really giving him his own book. I don't think it's the worst idea, but it is a little odd.
I think it's because of how the market was kind of set up in the 90s. Like, this is before the whole bubble popped in the comic book speculation market. But, like, now they just do stealth minis, like, they'll give Gwenpool, like, a run, and they'll say, like, oh, it's going to go on forever. And really, they mean, like, 6 issues.
Right, I
And
guess it's a little more honest.
yeah, like, here they're being honest with it. It's like, yeah, he's not. We don't have enough stories for a whole freaking one right now. Instead of just being like, oh yeah, no, this is a mainline title now.
And it's funny you said it that way too. That this wasn't really, when the collapse happened. I mean, it kind of is. It's kind of going on like during it and then after it when things start to recover. Like Venom is fairly consistently getting these little miniseries and constant appearances for 7 years or so.
Yeah, I mean, he's a cool character. There's always like ways to sprinkle him into his story, but I don't think like writers really had enough backstory to work with to make like a whole series out of him. That would change quite significantly, like where we're about to go to.
Really, I guess the best way to put it is that's probably about the time where the character cools. We do get in 2003 Venom #1 under the Tsunami imprint. What's interesting is that is actually Venom's first solo book. Not really referred to all that much. I will be frank. I read that entire run, and the one thing that sticks out in my head is that it is not actually Venom.
I think most people forget the entire Tsunami imprint at this point.
Which, well, they think they do, but everyone knows Runaways.
Yeah, yeah. I guess Runaways the big exception here, which they keep trying to make a thing, but it never quite gets there.
Yeah, and we could talk about Runaways more in depth one time, but it is kind of indicative of that era where I think because of the success of Marvel Knights, there was a push to make the superhero books a little more indie-ish. I don't think there's any real pushback on that. I don't think you can deny that was the way that they were going with everything. And, to a large extent, it worked, both for Marvel and DC at that point. I think there's sort of almost this little weird golden era in the early 2000s. But, yeah, you do get these weird results, like the first solo Venom book that isn't about Venom, really. About a different Venom. What's interesting is that series, kind of leads into what I think is narratively one of the most significant moments in the history of the character. That would be in Terry Dodson and Mark Millar's Marvel Knights Spider-Man. Once again, Marvel Knights getting name dropped, where a gangster named Angelo Fortunato pays for the symbiote that has been separated from Eddie Brock and briefly becomes Venom until he is essentially overpowered because Mr. Fortunato wasn't really worthy. And that symbiote goes to the now former Scorpion, Mac Gargan.
Yeah, I do agree that this is probably one of the biggest moments for the evolution of Venom. Because even though the symbiote was always like, oh, it can leave whenever, it never really left all that often until this point. And like from here on out, you see it like attaching to itself to like all kinds of things here. And I think that's really where you get like the symbiote as a character because now you have room to like really explore the symbiote alien outside of the backstory of Eddie Brock.
Yeah, and there's definitely, to give a lot of credit to writers like Larry Hama, Dave Michelini again. I even think Howard Mackey touched upon it. There were nods to this, and there was a lot of times where like the balance of power would shift between Eddie Brock and the symbiote. But yeah, this idea of Venom not having to be Eddie Brock and not being as contrived as the Tsunami Venom, and that's not an insult to Daniel Way's writing. I mean, it's a cool idea. It just, as we're sitting here, didn't seem to pan out all that much. We'll see what happens in King of Black. But Matt Gargan is Venom for a very long time. He's from 2004 to 2011. It is a familiar version of the costume. I always like to call it the Orca Venom because you can see the eyes under the white as opposed to the white being the eyes. But he gets a lot of cool little runs in there. Outside of the Marvel Knights Spider-Man, there's the run in Amazing Spider-Man where Eddie Brock shows up with the anti-Venom symbiote to fight him. He becomes Spider-Man in the Dark Avengers. Matt Gargan, as much as, I consider him to be the Scorpion and that's the bigger role for him in my head, if I had started reading comics in 2004, I don't know what I think.
Yeah, I think the Venom Scorpion, I wasn't reading comics around this time. Like I said many times at this podcast, I started around 2011. But even in like 2005, when I heard that, oh, the symbiote attached itself to Venom, I always thought that was a cool idea. Just because the Scorpion's kind of a minor league villain. And I guess the Venom symbiote gave him a bit of a power boost. And even back then, I guess it kind of opened my mind. It's like, well, who else could the Venom symbiote attach itself to? And I think the fact that also Bendis was kind of in charge of things around this time allowed really the character to really explore and grow. Because this is around Dark Reign and the Secret Invasion and all that stuff, which was a really tight story event throughout the mid 2000s.
Gargan is defined by the fact that he was Venom during this period of Marvel where it seemed like they were just going from event to event, which I don't think did a lot for most characters, but it really did allow him to keep the role, not be the focus necessarily of the stories, but to really get the audience comfortable with him in that role.
Yeah, there was no need to really push him out of that at that time. I mean, I guess I guess he's kind of a placeholder, but he was a good placeholder.
Yeah, I don't think I wouldn't, you know.
Yeah, placeholder is kind of a harsh term.
Yeah, I think that, let's say harsh. I don't know if harsh is what I was going to say, but I don't feel like that was the intention. I think he functioned. Placeholder. A placeholder would be one of the Venoms we'll get to in a little bit, but yeah, no, Matt Gargan was Venom for a long time. It stopped feeling like a gimmick after a while, and that's kind of when you know that the audience is getting comfortable with it. So as we were talking about, Gargan's really defined by being the Venom in those storylines, those tightly packed storylines that Marvel was doing for a long time. He loses the symbiote once again in Siege. It is acquired by the government, which leads to the next Venom, Flash Thompson. Flash Thompson, at this point in the story, is now a war hero who had to have his legs amputated, and he is given the symbiote as it, would augment his physical abilities. And so we enter, what most people refer to as the Agent Venom era.
Yeah, this was the era where I started to pick up comics too, so I was kind of confused, like why Flash Thompson suddenly had the Venom. And I guess retroactively in my mind, it's like, oh, I guess Flash Thompson always had the Venom symbiote and just completely overrode Eddie Brock in my mind. But I do like Agent Venom quite a lot because, it's one of my favorite writers, Rick Remender, really taking charge of this character in the first place. And he kind of turns the Venom symbiote more into a metaphor about like addiction and PTSD and trauma and things like that.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that through a little earlier, and I can't remember if we said this or not, that Eddie Brock comes back as anti-Venom.
Yes.
That's going to be significant as well, going through the run with Flash Thompson as this Agent Venom character.
Yeah, Eddie Brock is basically fighting to get back the Venom symbiote too, and he has special anti-venom powers, whatever that means.
Yeah, it's the anti-venom. Get it? Because Venom, like when someone gets bit, like an anti-venom. Get it?
Thanks, Dan Slott.
So this Agent Venom also goes through quite a bit of his own little stories. Eventually joins the Guardians of the Galaxy, which is kind of cool.
Like, this is where a lot of the retcons start to really happen, because this is where Bendis takes over. This was his Guardians of the Galaxy run.
Yeah, and this leads to a little era where I believe they refer to Venom as a Space Knight, if I'm correct.
Yeah. He's a space knight and he has a sword.
I mean, Venom can really do anything, right? Isn't that the truth?
Yeah, I guess so.
After a few years, six years as Venom, or Agent Venom, however you want to see it. He does eventually lose the symbiote, as is the sort of new pattern that's coming out. He was attacked by a special anti-venom suit agent who took the suit off of him. You see, that's what I love in comics, though. It's just like, oh, we made a suit. We made a suit to fight the other suit, and it worked. One of the things that's really cool, and you were talking about Remender sort of building this idea of like addiction and post-traumatic stress disorder. They also build this idea of the symbiote admiring Flash Thompson.
I read the Venom run, and a lot of it was him and the symbiote kind of arguing with each other and coming to terms with the fact that they both needed each other, because Flash Thompson didn't have legs to walk, and the symbiote could give him legs to walk, and the symbiote really just wanted to be like desired and worn. It's kind of like the toys from Toy Story in that way, which is, I'm sure, exactly what they imagine Venom to be. And which is something that Eddie Brock always dealt with too, but I think Remender is the one that really pulled that out more. And then Bendis kind of brought in more space elements to the whole idea of the symbiotes.
As the symbiote leaves, apparently it's driven crazy. That's a note I have here. So don't expect it to be super nice when it shows up again. And Flash would actually go on to get the anti-Venom symbiote and become Agent Anti-Venom, who looked like Agent Venom except had inverted colors.
It's a cool suit, but I think most people agree the black one's a bit better.
And we will jump ahead a little bit in time because we're really not going to go back to this much. Flash Thompson would die as that in that role, and so I think for Flash Thompson, once again, we see another situation where the symbiote has been used to make a character more interesting than they were before.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. At this point, a lot of other writers got involved with Venom beyond just the Agent Venom Remender stuff. And I think they found all they could do with Agent Venom, and killing off Flash Thompson, I think, was a good end to his storyline. And I think it opened new avenues for the Venom symbiote.
Obviously, the symbiote is not gone for long. January of 2017. Venom Volume 3 now, number 1. I think it's important to point out that we are now on Volume 3 of Venom, and Eddie Brock has not been the lead in any Venom ongoing series as of yet.
Yeah, I remember when they announced it and they said, oh, it's Eddie Brock. A lot of people got very excited.
Well, that's the funny thing about this book is it isn't Eddie Brock in issue 1.
Now, it's that other character. What's his name?
Lee Price. Lee Price, a somewhat small-time thug, takes on the Venom symbiote. The interesting thing here is Price doesn't want to be a hero, but now having been attached to Flash Thompson, the symbiote does. This leads to the new conflict between the symbiote and its host. And Price has this, I think, pretty interesting relationship compared to a lot of the other hosts where he might be the only one who kind of hates it. Like, he doesn't hate the power, but he doesn't really need that. He doesn't really want the symbiote.
Well, he hates talking to the symbiote. He likes the power. And I think that's the really big dynamic, because every other, I guess, wearer of the symbiote, like, they had like a mutual agreement with each other. And that maybe they didn't like each other, but like, I don't know, it's cool to have Venom power, so fuck it.
Mike Costa writing this book, that's significant for another reason as well. By issue 6, Eddie Brock has once again come together with the symbiote. So we now do have a Venom comic where Eddie Brock is Venom. It is an ongoing series, supposedly. And this is where this ended up crossing over a bit with Amazing Spider-Man. I think just because everyone was excited to kind of have classic Venom back.
Going back to his more 90s route, they kind of shed their edgier Leah Pierce for the classic Eddie Brock.
So Dan Slott does go on to use Eddie Brock in the Venom Inc. crossover. Brock becomes a pretty consistent feature in Amazing Spider-Man up until the end. of Slott's run. Once again now, with Brock under, I don't know, under the hood. Is that, I don't know. With Brock as Venom, he starts to appear more often in other books. This Mike Costa run doesn't get a ton of attention, but it was pretty successful and pretty well liked.
I think the weirdest thing about the Acosta run is the variant covers, because that's where you see like venomized Groot, venomized like Rocket Raccoon, venomized everything, and it accidentally created like several characters. Like Venom is spun out largely from these weird Venom variants of this new volume and this era, and
Yeah, you have that Venomized miniseries in there, Cullen Bunn and
yeah,
Iban Coelho on that. You do also have a story in there where they establish that Deadpool was at one point a Venom, which, I mean, of course, Deadpool was a Venom.
everyone gets a turn with the Venom
Yeah.
symbiote.
Even if everyone didn't, Deadpool would have ended up a Venom.
It's weird that the most recognized part of this run is just like the weird covers and that characters that accidentally spun out of those covers because they just looked cool.
Look, comic books are always in part aesthetic, and I think sometimes that's downplayed now, which I think is weird. I think to wage a criticism on both Marvel and DC, I think that they have lost a step or two with selection of artists. And I think that's always proven when you do have this over the top art that gets people interested. And somehow we're getting Venomized figures in 2020. um, and it was like, where does that come from? People didn't read the story, but the image sold that image, and apparently had a big enough impact to keep interest in it that long.
Well, soon we're going to have nullified statues of characters.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we already have some covers today, right?
Yeah.
You can figure out when we recorded this by that little clue. Come the summer of 2018, not too far into a long run for Costa's Venom Volume 3, there is a changeover, and we get a new Venom #1, still with Eddie Brock, and we'll get into that in a second. A really important thing to note here is Mike Costa still working in tandem, really, with Donny Cates at this point, with Venom first host, with Mark Bagley. This introduces Telkar, an agent of the Kree Empire during the Kree-Skrull War, who is the first host for this, I guess, implicitly baby symbiote, who would be Venom, and tells the story of how he uses the symbiote. It is eventually banished from him after he is imprisoned, and that is where Spider-Man picks up the symbiote during Secret Wars.
Like I mentioned earlier, during the Bendis run, he really played up the space aspect. Here, it was more like the symbiotes are their own like alien race, and they were good, and then they became evil. Cates gets into it. He's about to get into it.
And that's really where, Donny Cates, what's becoming a seminal run on Venom, begins. His sort of vision for Venom is taking everything that happened and putting it into context and making the story make more sense. Like we said, if we got into every person who had a symbiote and every time that has played out into the story, we'd be here forever. But to summarize Cates' run, he's really looking back at everything and finding the through lines. They'll throw in specials here and there. He has, a big blowout fight with Carnage. They really connect things even further back between the military and the use of Venom, which is cool because that relates to Venom Volume 1, that relates to Flash Thompson. They're bringing back his son from his now dead ex-wife, who is She-Venom. Like, every sort of little path that Cates can pull from, he is. The way he describes his writing is that all of the run are pieces that reflect each other and kind of talk to each other, which I think is a cool way to put it. And I think it is true. It's when you read Cates' Venom, you don't have to necessarily read everything that's come before it. That's not a requirement. but anything you did read with Venom kind of immediately counts, and somehow it's like palpable in it.
Yeah, Cates is somebody that's led like literally everything. It's insane, like all the weird stuff he draws upon, and I think Cates is kind of part of a new generation of writers that really do see like all the runs as being valid in some way or another, and I think is partly in contrast to the Bendis era, who was very like this run is just this run; it doesn't really relate to anything else, and I think as a consequence of like the post Morrison writing era, who also was very much about like every run counts.
Yeah, I think it's also taking what was being done between 10 and 20 years ago at DC and applying it.
Yeah,
That sort of John's view of the DCU, where just because something is inconvenient doesn't mean that you get rid of it. You make sure that you work with it and you make it into something cooler. And I think Kate's definitely has that feel to it. I I would hesitate to say that the writers who came out of that like Marvel Knights era were rejecting the past. I think it was just so difficult to get anything started that they all tried to kind of create their new version of the character.
yeah. I think it was a consequence of like how movie licensing was functioning at that point because everyone was trying to get their like movie license in, and I think at that point it was much harder to kind of explore other runs. So the mindset was very different. Like up until about the mid '90s, you had really long runs. Then after that, you had a bunch of really short runs.
Right, and I think we're stuck on these short runs where, but writers are really there are certain writers who are trying to push through that. I think Cates is one of them. I think Cates, while he is a writer of his time and is going to take the jobs that he can get, I honestly feel like when he approaches a book, he's really trying to lay the groundwork, even if it's not him for years of stories.
Yeah, and I think the basic example of that is where he starts off with Null, which is the god of the symbiotes. They
And
have a god now.
and obviously, the King in Black is a huge story that we will get into 1 second. I'm not going to let you go right into it, and we'll talk a little about that. But there's one more Venom that I have to mention. Venom 2099, Cronstone, first appearance, Spider-Man 2099, 35 in 1995. He is not significant at all. I just wanted to squeeze him in here um,
I mean, he is
because
cool.
background story is so insane that it's incredible. Cronstone is the older half brother of Miguel O'Hara, who is the Spider-Man of 2099, if you were unaware. Um, they have a terribly conflicted relationship, as you might expect. Cronstone is also drawn to look like he's like 65, which is just bizarre. Um, but the one really cool thing about Venom 2099 is I don't know if this is Peter David's idea, but they just decided that he was basically somewhere between Venom and like a xenomorph, and he has like acid, like saliva and stuff. It's great. You should
all,
read those like 2 issues he shows up in.
all those 2099 issues are pretty crazy. That's when Marvel was just like, yeah, just do whatever you want.
Spider-Man 2099 is a pretty solid book all the
Oh,
way.
yeah, it is.
It's also my argument is that it's a touch under the black costume, but the Spider-Man 2099 costume that's up there too as far as designs.
Yeah, I like how it's mostly blue with red highlights on it, as opposed to Spider Man's costume being red with mostly blue highlights on it.
And the spider's a skull. It's the most 1990s thing you could possibly do.
And he has the Mr. Sinister cape.
Yeah, yeah, those ragged little cape, and he has hook hand. He's great. But you were responsibly going towards the King in Black storyline featuring Null, this god of the symbiotes who is now attempting to ravage the universe. They did a really cool thing where he started popping up last month in comics that you might not have expected him to.
Little cameo appearances here and there where he's using his big sword to stab people and be really intimidating, saying, I'm going to kill everyone. Ooga booga.
I think literally he said that in one issue. No. But this is really the culmination of, at this point, what, about 2 years of work? A little more.
Yeah, Null also ties into like other stories too. Like I think Noel's example of Cates' like writing in general, and that like his first appearance is this really obscure like shadow image of somebody else's run, completely different run from like 2012 in Jason Aaron's Thor. And Cates is like, I'm going to make that a character now, and he makes it this integral character to not only just Venom, but like to Marvel Cosmic in general.
Yeah, and that's become really like his MO is, taking these sort of seemingly insignificant moments in comics and making them into something. This is an interesting thing because we just recorded the podcast on Ten of Swords, which, part of our argument is we don't really feel like it was really driven by Hickman. I think Hickman and Cates are similar in that way. I think Cates is kind of getting the advantage because he's similar in that way, but then he's still turning around and just every issue of his comics are fun and crazy, and you could probably jump into them without knowing everything.
Yeah, I'd agree. Cates is very much geared towards like, I guess like the death metal way of writing, like DC Dark Knight's death metal. That's what I mean, not like death metal music.
Right.
Though I'm sure that influences him as well. But like this idea is just like make it cool and big, and if it's stupid, it's stupid. That's fine. That just makes it cooler.
See, I think he's even a little smarter than the writing on like death metal. I think death metal is like that free for all where it's just crazy. I feel like Cates is really good at balancing the fun with the sort of nerdiness. And by balancing, I mean like 75% fun, 25% nerdiness.
Yeah, like people actually punch each other in Cates's book, as opposed
Right.
to Hickman, where they talk about punching each other.
Yeah, and this is not to bag on Hickman.
No,
Obviously,
it's not.
we both really enjoy his work. We certainly talked about it enough.
No is certainly like the next big Venom character right now, and that's not even in Cates's run. There's been a million other Venoms as well. Like there's a Dragon Venom, Dog Venom. You know,
Yeah,
we
Venom
don't.
having wings and flying was like a big thing for everybody. I, I, I have issues of the Venom series, that's been running for 2 years now that are already more valuable than like 30-year-old comics. Like it's just fun. King in Black. I think Marvel has a real good position right now. I think, we talked about this when we were talking about death metal. I think DC is about to pull that trigger on reducing their line, on going to, if in continuity, really limited sort of runs. If Marvel pull this off, and this is huge, it's basically a proof that DC is doing it wrong.
I
And
mean,
it could also like put this confidence into Marvel where they're not going to try anything like that. And that I certainly hope they're not going to try anything like that to start. But and I reducing the line, sure. But to the extent that it seems like DC is going, and to the extent that it seems like they are diluting the continuity they built, if this takes off and is huge, this could be years of Marvel going, okay, well, we're definitely not going to do that. And I think that's a really good thing.
yeah, I think the only reason like we're still early into the King of Black. To be upfront, this is on the Wednesday King of Black just came out.
Yeah, I haven't read issue 1 yet. I literally walked in the door and set up my computer to record this. So I have it sitting next to me. I just haven't read it yet.
But like I think if King of Black does become really successful, it only works because like it has like 30 years of setup in a weird way. And then like 2 really clear years where they said, okay, let's take everything and try to make a story out of it.
Right. And where has that been successful before? It's been successful with JSA. It's been successful with some of the Avengers runs. It can work.
Yeah, and I also think like I think we haven't really gotten too much into the backstory of Venom, which is fine. There's a lot. But I think what also makes Venom unique is like the history of Eddie Brock being like this kind of loser who's just kind of being vengeful. I think that really helps bring a character to Venom that allows all this weird space shit to really be pinned down by someone like Cates.
Yeah, it's great because Brock, starting out as this sort of, he was a villain, but always had that weird sympathetic angle. He's really become the character that the reader feels like they're closest to, which is this tough with a superhero book.
Yeah, it is tough, especially with a character that's supposed to be just like crazy Spider-Man. He's just insane. He's crazy.
But yeah, and I think that's where Cates was smart with using everything that's come is Venom started out as crazy Spider-Man and now very much isn't.
No, I think you even see it a bit in the Venom movie too, where like there Eddie Brock, yeah, he's like a weird loser, but like he does cool things and he's oddly relatable because he wants to do the right thing, but he just goes about it the wrong way. Which is something that was even done in like Lethal Protector all the way up until now, just in different forms. Even with like Flash Thompson and things like that. He was a government agent and he was always trying to do the right thing, but he very often like went too far and killed somebody. And that was also the same thing with like Eddie Brock and some other host that they slowly toned down over the years as they introduced more and more hosts. And I guess the symbiote got more and more diluted over time.
Yeah, I don't know about diluting though, because I feel like part of what we just went through is how it really got Eddie Brock back to this position.
Well, I mean diluting in the sense that like, you have characters like Mania and all these other like side symbiote characters that are like really able to control the symbiote. Where like Eddie Brock spent, kind of like a decade struggling with it and trying to figure out a way to like function with it on.
Okay, I don't know. I feel like that's where comic books let you forgive that. Well, bright future for Venom. Let's hope it's a bright future for Marvel. Uh, it is interesting that we are now back at Eddie Brock Venom, and it does in some ways feel like nothing's changed, but absolutely has. And I think if nothing else, that's why it's effective.
Yeah, I think with Eddie Brock, he has such like a good core to return to. It's the same way with Peter Parker in that like you can tell that origin story like time and time again, and it still hits. I mean, I don't want another Spider-Man origin movie. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that there's something very like relatable about that origin story and very classic. And I think there's something similar to that with Venom, besides him just being related to Peter Parker. I like I said, I think the Venom movie is kind of an example of that, in that you can kind of see, like a really solid story here with this alien symbiote.
Eddie Brock, what, only died once in this entire run? That's how many Venom stories there were that we skipped that. But
which is a good track record for a comic book character, only dying once.
oh yeah, no, I mean that's tough. I like what it did. I like where we are with Venom. No regrets, right?
No regret.
No regrets.
It's
Venom,
still
no
my.
regrets. That should be the name. We're gonna call the podcast that. But I think that brings us to the end of the topic today. As always, please check out our social media. You can find us at Dissecting Fiction pretty much everywhere. Just type in Dissecting Fiction and the form of social media you want us to be giving you content on. We might not be there, but we're probably there. But check it out. We're on YouTube. We're on most major podcast platforms. Please subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. Hit the bell. 5 stars. Anything good. Just do it. If you're in the market for some toys, for some statues, anything of that ilk, check out ToyStoreGuide.com. They'll connect you with some great local independent businesses. Support all your local independent businesses these days. They certainly need it. Any other thoughts, Christian?
Check out The Wicked and the Divine. It's a bit of an older book, but it's a really cool indie book about gods as pop stars.
Oh, I didn't know that was what it was about. I've seen it a bunch of times.
Yeah, written by Carrie Gillian, so there's a bunch of obscure music references to like David Bowie and stuff, but it's about gods being petty pop stars to each other.
Sounds about right. Well, we'll end it there. I'm Vinny Murphy.
And I'm Christian Cutlick.
And thanks for listening.